Welcome, everybody. GEEX is a nonprofit online educational platform that produces lectures, community building programs, and resources for professional development. We hope to redefine Glass culture by centering voices that have been historically marginalized in the field. GEEX Talks, and then can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. GEEX Talks will feature Victoria Amadizada Melendez, Diani White-Hawk, Kimberly Thomas, and Britt Ransom this year. Victoria's talk is now available, and Diani White-Hawk's is coming in late November. The GEEX Writing Center is now open. Writing consultations are now open for scheduling on the GEEX website. The Writing Center is a judgment-free space for translating visual artwork into language and writing. Please come as you are and use these one-on-one consultations for starting a new writing project or improving your existing writing. Check out Lydia's listening sessions, consults that open a space to vent your writing into existence. 40-minute appointments on a sliding scale basis. This is a great deal. And the Penland Scholarship applications are due November 15th, so that would be a great resource to use for your applications. And we're going to drop some links into the chat here so that you'll have easy access to all of these resources. We have 3 light housekeeping points. Just a reminder that everybody in this space should have read and agreed to the GEEX Code of Conduct, and we'll put a refresher of these guidelines in the chat thread for your reference. Secondly, if you're new to Google Meet, you'll want to familiarize yourself with the standard controls at the center bottom of your screen to mute and unmute, and to turn your video on and off, to use the hand raise function, and to disconnect from the call. And on the bottom right is where you can access the chat function and some other tools that we probably won't use tonight. Lastly, if you prefer the Zoom style gallery view to see everyone in this call, you can click on the 3-dot pop-up menu. And in that pop-up menu, select Change Layout, which will open up a menu of options you can adjust to your desired settings. For a Zoom gallery comparable experience, you can select Tiled and then adjust the slider to however many faces you want to see at once. Lastly, GEEX has developed a resource exchange where we're archiving tonight's meeting and past Flame Affinity meetings for those who couldn't make it, and as well as for future utility. By joining us tonight, please know that your contributions to the discussion will be recorded and publicly shared. And we're going to paste in some links to the meeting notes from previous meetings. So tonight's agenda, it's teacher roll call tonight. And our agenda for tonight is we're going to do a little icebreaker and kind of ask the crowd, where and what are you teaching? And just some questions to keep in mind as we're chatting tonight. Can we define teaching? What is not teaching? What is your, look for some kind of creative answers to that. What is your relationship to knowledge if you're self-taught? What is your favorite thing to teach? What do your students want you to teach? Are those the same thing? Are they different? What have you learned about teaching by being a student? And we have a new component for the meeting tonight. We're going to try a peer-to-peer exchange where we can ask each other questions. And there's so much experience here in the Zoom room tonight that I think it'll be really great resource to be able to ask each other questions and then give advice peer-to-peer. So we're going to give that out a shot tonight, and everybody's welcome. We want to give a shout out and a huge thanks to our sponsors for this meeting, High Volume Oxygen and Griffin Glass Tools. High Volume Oxygen is proud to support this meeting of the GEEX Flame Affinity Group. Are you ready to be oxygen independent? The HVO system is built by glassblowers for glassblowers. High Volume Oxygen has oxygen solutions for flameworking studios of all sizes and is in studios and institutions around the world. Why choose HVO over other systems? Expandability, reliability, and safety. Join the oxygen revolution. Find out more at highvolumeoxygen.com. And I just want to give a little shout out to High Volume Oxygen I use a high volume oxygen system in my studio. I'm in the high HVO fam and love their gear. Can't speak highly enough about the service and the products. So give them a go over to the website and check them out. And this Flame Affinity Group meeting is also made possible by Griffin Glass Tools, designing glass working tools and equipment with a clear understanding of the glassworker's needs, proudly serving the glass community since 1999. And you can find out more at Griffin's website, griffinglass.com. And again, just a longstanding supporter of the community, Griffin Glass Tools. Most of us probably have used some of the sculpting tools or various tools that that have been made. And I also want to give a shout out to Griffin Tools for making accessible ventilation systems that are drop shipped. And I use these in my studio as well. So just another great resource that's affordable for putting together a flameworking studio. So thanks so much for our sponsors. We really appreciate you sponsoring this meeting. Okay, to keep programs like the Flame Affinity Group accessible to the broader community, there are a number of ways that you can support GEEX. You can buy merch through the GEEX shop, like, for example, the Better Together bandana, Vanessa German's generative poster on centering dimensional wholeness, and our whole collection of glassy mugs made in collaboration with Dr. Jane Cook. Another way that you can support GEEX is subscribing or renewing your individual or a school's GEEX Talk subscription. You could nominate GEEX for a Glassy Baby Grant, or you could set up an independent fundraiser on Facebook or Instagram. Contributions of any size help, and thanks so much for your ongoing support. Venmo donations are now available as well. This is a new thing, so feel free to screenshot this QR code to link directly to Venmo. And as a reminder, just throw some support towards GEEX if you're able. Thank you so much for being here and for spending your Monday evening with GEEX. And as a reminder, thanks so much for your support and anything you're able to give. We're so happy to present this programming, and thank you so much for supporting GEEX and this programming. All right, thanks, Madeline. We're back to the grid here. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is an especially exciting meeting topic tonight that I just can't wait to dig right into it. So this is the teacher roll call. So I know that there are a lot of teachers in the group tonight, and you do not need to be a teacher to be here, but I'm curious to know. Let's just, oh, actually, you know what? Before we move on, let's just do one more housekeeping thing. So there's a few ways that you can participate here. One way is you can work the chat, and then Madeline and I forgot to introduce Madeline, my co-facilitator, Madeline Rouse-Smith, and I'm Amy Lemaire. Sorry, I should have done that first. Hi. So there's two ways. We'll be your facilitators. So just to kind of direct traffic. So there's two ways. You can type in the chat your thoughts, your questions, your responses, type to each other, anything that you'd like if you feel comfortable. And then also if you would like to speak, then please use the hand raise function on the bottom, one of the bottom buttons, and Madeline or I will call on you. So that way we just don't talk over each other, because it's a large group and we want to be able to all be heard and all speak. So please be generous. If you're speaking a lot, please kind of hang back and do some listening. And if you haven't spoken, please feel free to speak up. That's what we're here for tonight. So with that, let's kick it off. So tonight's icebreaker, I would like to ask everybody to, or whoever feels comfortable, to introduce yourself and tell us, where are you teaching and what are you teaching? And if you don't self-identify as a teacher, feel free to pop on and introduce yourself anyway and share some thoughts about teaching. So would anybody like to start? Sally, you can unmute yourself. Oh, you're muted.
There you go. Okay.
All right.
So I'm Sally Prosh, and I'm teaching at the University of Massachusetts, and I teach at Penland and Pilchuck and Pittsburgh Glass Center and Urban also. And I started teaching before I could get paid, and they saved my paycheck until I turned 15. And so it was a lot of fun. So I've seen a lot of changes happen in the glass world, and that's been really exciting. So
That's awesome, Sally. I should also, while we're waiting for somebody else to raise their hand, I'm also just going to chime in here and say I'm currently teaching plasma design at Salem Community College in the Scientific Glass Technologies program, which is a huge honor. My students are great this semester. We're just starting to fill plasma bulbs. And I also teach around the country as well, various different types of workshops that are all related to flameworking in some way. And I've been teaching for about 20 years. All right. Would anybody else like to introduce themselves and tell us where you're teaching and what you're teaching? Percy.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Percy. I teach at the Pittsburgh Glass Center primarily, but recently have been teaching in a lot of different places, whether that's the Pittsburgh Glass Center itself for the summer or what's coming up at Urban Glass. I've been at Pilchuck. I teach on the internet technically by the way that I educate. So the focus is primarily plasma, and that's taken me through a lot of different materials, a lot of different mediums within glass. So that's where I'm at.
Great. Thanks, Percy. And I love that you're using the internet to teach. I think that's really progressive. And I also noticed that you had you did a little crowdsourcing recently for the content for one of your classes, which was pretty interesting. I don't know if that's okay to bring up, but yeah, I thought that was really, a really great way to like get in contact with your students before the class even starts, so they can have a say in what you're teaching.
Yeah, there's sort of a difference in how you want to think about teaching plasma, because it can happen in so many different fields, and trying to find a way to isolate it or find a greater spectrum of value. I thought it was easier to sort of ask the crowd to get feedback, which is important.
Yeah. That's awesome. So what did you decide on? Can you tell us?
Yeah, we ended up deciding on the kiln class, which kind of was going to go that way anyways, because by the time I got feedback from Urban Glass, there was already a hot shop class going at that time. And I was personally really leaning that direction, but seeing everyone else lean that direction helped kind of solidify how I want to build that class out.
Yeah. That's great. I feel like that's one of the things that's always sort of interesting is like meeting the expectations of your students, but also like trying to bring your resources to the table too. Oh yeah, Percy, was how can you tell us a little bit more about like how you crowdsourced that? Was it an online poll? I think maybe not everyone might have seen your post.
Yeah, I used Instagram to put a poll on stories, and then I also put it on to Facebook where it can kind of stand there a little bit longer. I'm also learning that you can actually put a longer standing poll in your posts. So if that's something you want to do, you can make use of that on Instagram if you have. It's just another way to reach out to people. And if you have a mailing list, I didn't do a mailing list. I was doing something really quick to kind of get people's attention. Mm-hmm. I found that it's easier to grab people on like Facebook or Instagram than it was through email sometimes. So that's sort of what I was doing, putting a poll up. And I did the same thing when I was basically getting information for gases for plasma, just trying to see what type of connections people had on their systems, what gases they were purchasing, what size they were purchasing, so I can work it out with my partner, which is Global Gases, to figure out what we're going to set up on the website. So things like that, I kind of put it everywhere.
That's great. I love that as a new model where you're like in direct communication with your audience too. That seems to be, I mean, at least for me as a teacher, a new thing as we're moving more and more online. So that's great. Anybody else in the group like to introduce themselves? Oh, Sally. Yes.
Yeah, the whole thing online is just so great, and it has so changed the way the classes have evolved. I mean, now all my students can just take video of my demos and have that for, ever. And it's really nice. And I just really appreciate it so much. What did we do before this? I don't know.
That's interesting that you you mentioned video. Do you have a video policy when you teach?
I tell people that they can video anything at any time. It's an open book, and just go for it. And if they want to share it, they can share it. I'm okay with that. I know not everybody's okay with that, but that's what we do. Yeah. So it's really helpful, I think, because, when I teach at the university, it's, I have them for such a short time, and then they can practice forever, right? But I'm doing something else while they're practicing, so then they can refer to their video. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. That came up recently. I was teaching a workshop, and I was teaching at Harvard, and they asked me what my policy was, and I said, well, what I feel comfortable with is small snippets for the internet, but I don't want anybody to put the entire workshop online, because then they're not going to come to the workshop. So they can record it for their own purposes, but for online, yeah, I usually like to do shorter. And also, I think that that's more in line with people's attention span for the internet as well. But for my college course that I teach, we record all the demos, and we have an archive that the students can access for the semester. So that way, like you were talking about doing a demo, the students can, they see the demo, and then they can watch it over during the week asynchronously. So that's new for me, teaching with video. So I'm still getting used to it. Percy, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I never really thought about the video aspect so much. The one thing that I kind of make sure is that whoever's videotaping is focusing on me, and I'm the main focus, and anyone else that's in the frame is like okay with being filmed. I try to make sure that's communicated. But it's awesome because like oftentimes when you're teaching, you're very focused on teaching, and like having a student pull their like images or videos so you can kind of share it with everyone else helps too, because that's what I've done with the classes this past summer. We have people pull in their videos and images so everyone has access to it, because some people have a better angle than others, and maybe they caught something while someone was doing something else during that time. So, and if it was like, for example, if the workshop or like an entire demo was entirely online, I personally don't feel worried about that, because part of the reason why people come to those workshops is to be able to have that easier access to have that conversation, where sometimes the same questions will come from a distance where they can kind of look at a video or whatnot. So it's always a mix of different approaches. There's always going to be a capacity where people will want to be there in person or ask you directly or be in your presence or see it, straight up. So I don't feel bothered by that so much.
Madeline.
Hey guys, great to see you all. I think the video thing is so interesting, and I for the past couple of years have been recording all of my demos for my semester's long class, and I just put them on YouTube for a YouTube playlist. One thing that I love about our setup at Salem, I teach at Salem Community College, so we have a camera at the instructor bench, like mounted like bird's eye view over the torch, which is like an incredible angle that no one, like you never get to see that. Like only I usually get to see it unless you're standing literally in back of me. And I always tell my students like, come on, come around, like stand over my shoulder. It's okay. But they're really afraid to. And so much of it is so minute detail. I'm like, yeah, you guys can, it's like sometimes hard to get people to come closer. Maybe it's like a post-COVID thing. But it's amazing because it's hooked up to a big, like I call it the Jumbotron, a big TV screen, and people can watch that. So it's next to me. And often people, instead of looking at me, they'll just like be kind of like staring like, to my left at the screen, which is a little funny because I'm like, okay, they're still watching. But but it's super, like, it's so incredibly helpful. And then those are usually recorded and I put online. And then at the same time, I've started like doubling up, because like that goes into our institutional Canvas. But then I also film it on my phone with a Diddy clip. I just like I like lean it against my knockoff bucket, and then I'll shoot like a quick a video of my demos and put that on YouTube as well. Yeah, that way, like any student who missed anything, like there's no excuse, like they can review things. Cause I think like the thing with video that's so helpful for me is like, I'm an avid note taker, but like I can't always watch, and then, and take notes at the same time. I really struggle with that personally. Yeah, I know. I need to get a tripod. I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm so low tech here. But I found that's so helpful for students to be able to be like, yeah, you can just video it. And if you put anything online, make sure I look good. Like, make sure I don't look like, my really bad, and make sure it's like semi not unflattering. But then you can, review it later. So that's what I found is like so helpful.
Yeah, the video aspect just adds a whole other dimension to teaching. It's just like another hat that we wear now as teachers. So still acclimating. Priscilla, hi. Oh, you are muted. There you go.
I just like you guys mentioned like note taking. I find that a lot of my students, they like nobody, and I like require them to bring a sketchbook. I require them to take notes. I like look at their sketchbook, but like I find that like I don't know if it's this generation of kids or like students, they're just like not, they just stare at you blankly and they don't take notes. They sit very far away. Like, how do you encourage beyond video to like get them to take, because then they're literally in the next class asking you to like, oh, how did you do that? And I don't know what it is. Like, I've started breaking down, making each step of a demo that I'm doing, and then like putting it on on a little board so that they have each step to follow, and that seemed to have helped. But like, how do you guys encourage more note taking or more attentive learning? By the way, I teach at RIT. Flameworking and kiln casting. Sorry.
Awesome. Well, I'll chime in on that. I have a larger group this semester and of different skill levels. And one of the things that I've been doing is I've been bringing in related objects and objects that are sort of in the process, and I'll pass them around while I'm demoing, because, as we know, when you're blowing glass, there can be some times where you're just like watching the glass melt and like do certain parts of it. And so I'm just like afraid I'm going to lose folks' attention. So I that's a new thing. And plus I have so much like cool stuff in my studio. I just kind of want to share it. So I've just been bringing it in for show and tell, passing it around. And just so that like, I think that our students are a little bit used to multitasking when they're learning. So I'm doing it as an experiment this semester just to kind of see if there's anything I can glean from the experience. But so far, so good. Yeah. Madeline.
I love like doing a little show and tell during demos. Like whenever I like make something or demo something, like I always hand it to them and like pass it around, like whether or not I feel like they really need to see it up close, because like some of them do like to see it up close, but then it also just gets them involved in some way. Because I totally agree with you, Priscilla. Like, I mean, it's definitely hit and miss like for different groups, but like some students like are just amazing note takers, and like I don't even have to ask them to. And then some are like I feel like I'm pulling teeth to get them to like even bring a sketchbook. And I think maybe it's like I don't know if it's a generational thing, or some people just it's never occurred to them like to take notes. But like what I find is just I'm always just like, well, yes, I went over this before. Like, this is so much information. Like, there's no way you think you're going to remember this. In a week, you're not going to remember this. So like, if you brought your sketchbook last week, you would have remembered. But I also do like have the same like challenge as you. And I sometimes will draw like diagrams on the board if they're simple, for them to replicate. I think that's like a very generous and like wonderful thing for a teacher to do. I'm not good. Like mine kind of look like garbage when I draw on the board. So like, But at least like people know like this is the thing to write down. So I find that does help sometimes, but that takes a lot of time, like before class, to even prep that. So yeah, it's an interesting question.
Thanks, Madeline. Sally.
Yeah, I also, before the demo, I might ask, how would you do this? You know, like, and go around the class, like, what steps would you take to make this? You know, just get them kind of talking about it and interacting with each other. Another thing I'll have to say, I've taught with Jake Fishman quite a few times, and he'll tell jokes through his whole demo. And sometimes people miss the whole demo because they're listening to his jokes. But, you know, just to lighten it up and get interaction between people, you know, somehow get vocabulary going. Not everybody takes notes, and I don't make them take notes if they don't want to. They don't want to sketch, they don't sketch. You know, people learn different ways, you know. I tell them that's the way I learn, and I like to take notes, but it's not the way everybody takes notes.
You know, sometimes I provide handouts as well, which so that they can, if it's something I really want them to have a reference for, then I will deploy that. Percy, you have something to add?
Yeah, it's like whenever you're teaching, you have to. What I do is I think about like leading with an example, and then finding ways to like shift a mindset. So there's people with different learning methods, and I had what I learned a lot was going to Pilchuck, and I had a diverse group of people with different language, different ways that they learn. Maybe they had, and so what I did is I made sure everyone. Like, number one, I have my lectures and slideshows that people can access before I actually do the lecture and slideshow. And then I will work with them to, see where they're at. Because some people, they need to have more of a text translator they have to hear it again. They can't just look at their writing. And then like engaging the student in some ways. So like the major note taking that happens in like the plasma classes I teach is often in like the super sexy and exciting part where you're filling with gases and lighting it up. And Harry had like this great sense of like how to like get students to take notes there, because that allows you to repeat what steps are happening in the process. And we engage the students because they were making decisions towards the end goal of what gases are going in there. But then we had started with an example of like, okay, write how much we added in there, what gas it was, and then describe at each step that we stopped. And then on the side, you would draw the shape of the glass that we filled up. And then that would allow you to have a better sense of like why this effect was happening and where, and you can kind of trace those steps back through. It's still a little messy, right? But it allows you to find a trail. And that's something I'm working with a few people to kind of figure out what would a notebook look like? How would you organize your notes if you were going to do that same process? But, it can be sometimes challenging to kind of figure that out. I think most of the drawing or note taking happens when you like ask a question to a student, like, or they want to make something. And I said, well, let's draw me something so I can help you break it down. And then I'll have them draw each step of the way, and then they can work through it. That's sort of how I've experienced that same situation. And sometimes you just can't force them to take notes, and that's on them at that point.
Thanks, Percy. Janine. Hi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Janine Bressner. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island, and I wanted to speak up because I realized, I'm like one of those students who just blankly stares and doesn't contribute their voice. I am not currently teaching. I have taught lamp work at Urban and at Snow Farm. I'm currently getting an MFA at RISD for illustration because I'm making 3-dimensional illustrations that are dioramas of lamp worked glass and laser cut textiles that I'm photographing to illustrate children's books that I wrote. And I started teaching art when I was 15 years old, and now I'm 44. And that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. It's great to see you here. Actually, we do have another, I have a, well, maybe we should wait on it. but your experience as a student, and yeah, I wonder if that gives you some insight into the role of the teacher.
Oh, definitely. I'm TA. I've been TAing 3D illustration, and I'm twice the age of most of my peers, roughly, or a lot of my peers. And so I inevitably function as a TA in every class that I'm in, because the visiting artists are my friends, and the people in the slideshows, it's like, oh yeah, that's my friend. Or if you need to be connected with a resource, I can help you build a bridge for you, or help you build a bridge to all of these, artists that you're learning about or that you should know about. So I have suggestions, and it's interesting because it's making me realize, oh, I'm so much more qualified to be teaching at this level than I had realized. And so, because I've been in isolation at the Torch in my studio by myself for 25 years, mostly, then when I'm in a context, I'm like, oh, I know more than I thought. And to be mirrored by all of the young people around me, or to not be mirrored, is like very fortifying my sense of self, or like, helping me understand myself more. But I love teaching, and I really want to be here. And I could teach in the glass department, I could teach in the jewelry department, I could teach in illustration, and I don't know what'll happen, but I feel more driven to definitely teach her, because my kid just said, oh, I want to go to RISD. It's like, if I'm faculty, they get a full ride. But they turn 9 this month, so I have time. We'll figure it out.
Sounds good. Sounds like you have a lot of options. Thanks, Janine. Sean.
Hi. Yeah, it's a good segue, because I'm pop us into a fully active Flameworking class in our classroom. I'm a technician, not necessarily a Flameworking educator, but I've been working at the UW in our glass program, UW, not Wisconsin. Helen's claimed staked the claim on UW. So we're at the University of Washington, and I'm gonna show you guys around just briefly while I have the opportunity, because we've been revamping our Flameworking studio. What it started out as a small metal studio in that program, got canned essentially a number of years ago along with weaving, and then when Mark Zirkel was here, he established it as a Flameworking studio. But we just remodeled the studio, and a number of people in this group were really instrumental in helping answer some questions that I had, and I have many more, but I'm just gonna pop in here real quick, turn my video on, and flip you around.
Yes, please. Okay, so if you want to see, now would be the time to pin Sean's cube. If you want to see his cube bigger, I don't know how you all are viewing this right now, but just heads up.
So we just had a visitor in here, Patricia Davidson came in and did a demo for KCJ, who's currently teaching, KCJ Sludinsky. And we have 14 stations, each outfitted with either a little torch or a national, an instructor bench. I loved hearing the ideas about the overhead, because we have the screen right there next to the instructor station. And then we have the gas all plumbed down the center. Each table has its own set of regulators and shutoff valves. We've got a couple of different annealers and a sandblaster in here, and kind of trying to stay out of everybody's way. But just wanted to put that on everybody's radar. Say hi, KCJ. So there you have it.
Wow,
Hey,
thank you so
everyone.
much, Sean. It's great to see teaching in action.
Yeah, totally. They're all
Great
the
to see
hangers
it.
on. Class ended 20 minutes ago, but I definitely have questions for this group as far as accessibility, like making this space accessible to students, and how those of you that teach in institutions, how much responsibility you give to students to work kind of on their own without, a monitor, or how, what different structures like that look like. Because we've used student monitors in the past. I feel really confident in the sort of safety aspect of, as far as gas plumbing and stuff goes and all that, but like how much leash do you give, undergraduate students who are fairly new to this process? These aren't art majors necessarily. This is introductory flameworking class. So those are the questions
Yeah.
on my mind, more from like how much access do you give outside of class? What do you feel like is necessary for people to accomplish the goals of your curriculum in order to work outside of class? Those sorts of things are what's on my mind.
Thanks, Sean, and thanks for the question. If anybody has any feedback for Sean, raise your hand or pop it in the chat. And Mose, you wanna say something? Hi.
Hey, sorry. There's a lot going on. Just want to thank Madeline and Amy for hosting this and making this accessible. Can you guys hear me pretty good? Cool.
Yep.
So I'm fairly new to the teaching process. I've been kind of, in my own world on the West Coast over here. And I've gotten to learn from a lot of different people. And I think I'm in a process of new discovery. So I started maybe teaching earlier this year out of Bay Area Glass Institute. They have a really cool program that Sarah and Aaron are kind of developing. Amy was there last year, where they're kind of like bringing in different artists and you kind of get to create your own curriculum. So I've taught there twice, beginner classes. And it's been great. It's been kind of like as each time develops, I learn new things. I found just like being able to kind of keep it like short and simple on the demos, but let them play is kind of what my approach is. Like I said, it's a beginner class, so you're not looking for any advanced techniques. I just want to get them comfortable with the glass. And really, in that stage, I think there's a lot of in my opinion, even though I took traditional flame working and things like that, I'm kind of being like, here's the basics, but like really you might discover something completely new and go for it and let them kind of experiment. A lot of my classes are designed around play. And I'm recently in the process of tomorrow, I have an interview for a cool workshop where I will be, if I get the job, it's to train artists how to be entrepreneurs. They give you like this cool training workshop where they kind of teach artists how to budget things and become entrepreneurial. So that's kind of exciting. And then I'm also in the process of working on some STEAM proposals, like some grants for basically kids of color to do like science art camp. With glass and experiment, things like that. So I just wrote like a $15,000 grant proposal. I'll find that out this week if I get it. California right now is in a like emergence of really trying to get less privileged people into art, but also trying to make art like sustainable to live off of. There's some really big grants. Some friends just got like $100,000 stipend grants where they work with nonprofits each year for a year to teach and to help the organizations. So I'm kind of starting to dive more into that world of being able to kind of pass the knowledge on. I feel like there's kind of a lack in that in the glass world of like OGs kind of still holding on to things and still wanting you to support them and take their classes, but they're not like, hey, let me like come through and, help support you. And then on Thursday, I will be consulting with my first tech company to come into San Francisco and to teach some new employees some simple things on glass. They want to kind of, they have some cool tech that they're working on in a product. So they found me and hired me to come in and teach their employees on some simple things with glass. And so that will be like my first, I sent them the invoice for all the things and all that. So it's kind of like a new time where like kind of reaching like consulting level with like tech companies that I've been trying to get into. I left that because I wasn't respected. So I'm trying to now do it as like my own business and then kind of merging with that with a little bit of nonprofit and entrepreneurship. So I'm really grateful for this conversation and this opportunity because it's kind of like new horizons for me to explore outside of just, making stuff and selling it.
Well, thanks, Mose. It sounds like you're blazing a trail over there, so keep it up. That's awesome. So we have some little thread going on in the chat here in response to Sean's question that maybe we can circle back to. And Sally, I saw you had your hand up. Do you want to say something?
Well, just wanted to say a couple of different things.
Yeah.
On what I do is if I'm there, they can work. So whenever the glass lab is open, because that's the only time it's open is when I'm there, students can come in and work. And, after their first lesson, they feel pretty confident turning on and off the torch. They each have their own regulators, so nothing's going to flash back to other stations. It feels pretty safe. So I just let them work. And then also we started a new thing at the university. I had like the science librarians come in and do a little workshop. And so different groups on campus are coming in and renting out the glass shop and me to teach them a little bit about glass. So you can relate, your glass to history, to science, to archaeology, to, just so many different things. And so you can bring those people in. And so, Mose, that might be something you might want to try too.
Thanks, Sally. It's a great idea. Sean, in response to your question too, I just wanted to say, one of the strategies that I've taken that has worked quite well is if you're able to just get as many people into the flame shop as possible, like teach as many people about the safety, about how it works in there. Then when you spread that knowledge around, you're going to have less folks who are like, what do I do? How do I turn stuff on? So teach everybody how to turn it on, how to turn everything on, how to turn everything off, safety procedures. So that way, if there's a student in there who is maybe a little new, there'll always be somebody around. And I know the program's new, so that will gain traction over time. But that tends to work pretty well. And then it empowers students. You're not like really deputizing students so much as like empowering them to kind of skill share, or even a little bit of like kind of maybe a little teaching. You can kind of maybe identify teachers out of that group too. That's another like kind of added benefit. So you can get creative with it. But I agree with the buddy system too. All right. Is there anybody here who doesn't identify as a teacher, who's autodidactic, and maybe you are your own teacher, something along those lines, or any other thoughts about like the role of the teacher that maybe we haven't considered? If you're self-taught, are you your own teacher in some way? I think maybe. All right, let's see here. Oh, Madeline, yes.
I think being an autodidact or being a self-taught is you are a teacher, right? So like, I mean, as someone who started like pretty much self-taught or like learned from YouTube a lot in the beginning, I feel like it requires just as much like the same type of like focus or like structure, kind of seeking out information. And then sometimes something I've kind of noticed as a teacher is sometimes, and you guys tell me what you think about this, is like the more information a student has, or like the more access to information, the more I give to them, the less they like kind of, I don't want to say don't appreciate the information, but like they almost kind of might start to take it for granted, or they become enabled to like not think critically themselves, or not like, figure something out for themselves. So that's something I've been trying to do, is like find the balance between those two things, where it's like have the students like try to teach themselves a little bit. Like I tend to be like an overstimulation, like give tons and tons of information, but like at a certain point I'm like, wait, no, I need to pull back a little bit, because at a certain point a student, especially a beginner, like they're only going to be able to take in so much information. So like, I really want them to almost like, listen to what I'm saying, but like then start thinking critically and asking themselves the critical information and trying to find that sweet balance where it's like they can get the information they need, but they're also like empowering themselves to figure out what questions they have. So I'm not creating the questions and the answers for them. But yeah, I was curious if anyone had thoughts about that as far as like students teaching themselves and stuff like that.
Percy, do you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah. I would kind of say that we're all kind of like teaching ourselves, even students. So we may be learning from somebody, but we are also teaching ourselves what that person is teaching us. And so sort of like when you're trying to approach like I know I'm overloading my students all the time with information. I can't help it, but at the same time, I kind of go about like more of a philosophical approach where I start to let me just give an example. My favorite moment is when I can say I don't know, because then we can all look at that same thing, and someone else who knows more than I do about that subject may find an avenue which we can kind of dive into later. But yeah, you're right. It's like very important to find a way to have students be able to navigate a problem or navigate like learning something. And that sort of involves just kind of doing what you have been doing, which is kind of leading them through how you've approached a moment of learning. Leading with some kind of like moment where you learn something, and then they kind of see that it does take a moment to break down stuff. And like think, and this is hard for students, but failure is like a growth accelerator. So like I fail all the time. And then when students aren't used to that consistent, strong failure, I can like help them figure out what's happening there, because I often know there's all sorts of little patterns that lead us to that failure. And that's where you really learn. So finding ways in the teaching process where failure is going to exist, to highlight those failures so that they can learn. Just in general.
That's a good point with failure. My students always comment because I fail all the time, and I just am doing my process in front of the students, but they, a lot of the feedback I get from my students is that when I fail, it's even more valuable to them because they can see how I can overcome, the failure, or let's say the piece cracks. How do you fix that? And how do I respond? Am I getting all worked up? Am I staying calm? And so I think that that's important for the students to see too. And you don't always see that by a master glassblower. If you see somebody who just does a perfect demo, that's great. There's tons of educational value in that as well. But also for beginners, in order to get to that point, they have to be able to navigate failure as well. So, yeah. Madeline.
Yeah, I think exactly with you on that. Like, I used to be so scared to mess up on my demos when I was teaching, and then I was like, now I'm like, oh, if I mess up, like that's great. And I'm always like, hey, like it's great if a piece cracks or whatever. Like, it's great you guys can see like I mess up and you can see how I fix it. And I think like learning how to fix something is just as important, if not more important, than learning how to make something. And it is so important because that's another thing. Like I kind of struggle with as a teacher, where it's like, if I demo something, I teach a lot of like beginning classes. And so like, how to make like the ball, how to make the sphere, like all these shapes. And like, I do it quickly because I've done it 1,000 times. And then students get so frustrated because it's harder when they do it. And like, I even warn them right off the bat, like, just try to fail. Like you're going to mess up at first. It's not going to be perfect. Like your goal should be just to play around and like not to make anything perfect the first few weeks. But like some students, I really like, I find myself like trying, like being like a life coach or something, where it's like, you have to learn to persevere. Like, just don't give up, like keep going. Like, don't, like I failed so many times. Like you should have seen me when I was starting. And like, I don't know, recently I had a student who was really frustrated about this, and it was in a short workshop. And I was like, how can I make her happy? I'm a people pleaser, I guess. I'm like, how can I like make you like just happy and comfortable failing so you can actually improve and have a good time? And well, she was like, you should start bringing in like some of your earliest pieces, like from when you were starting. so we can like be like, you know, encouraged. And I was like, oh, that literally never occurred to me. Like, I don't think it, like, my mom always told me don't show like bad early work, but like I was thinking of like, maybe that could be encouraging. So I was kind of curious, like for you guys, like, how do you deal with like frustration in students? Cause like class is so hard, and yeah, it's always a thing. People are like, some people really get frustrated. Oh, you're muted, Amy.
Sorry. Thanks, Madeline. How do we deal with frustration? That's a great question. I have something to say to that, but Sally has her hand raised. So let's hear from Sally first.
Yeah, I have something to say to frustration too, but a lot of times what I do is I make a piece and then I say, but maybe this might happen. And I'll take that bubble and and it's all crooked and mashed and horrible. And I say, but don't worry, you can fix it. Glass is forgiving, you just melt it. And then I say, it's all about not freaking out. I mean, really, you know, in life, it's all about not freaking out and just taking your time and gathering that glass and then blowing out another beautiful bubble. You know, so I tell them just to go ahead and make their bubbles, mash it up, blow it again. You know, don't waste glass, just keep doing it. And then for frustration, what I have is a huge library on glass. And I go, you're going to get frustrated in this class. When you get really frustrated, you're not going to do very good work. So go out in the other room and just look through the books for a while and just settle down.
Absolutely. Real quick, and then we'll do Kate and then Madeline. But I'd like to share one of my favorite classes that sessions that I ever taught was about failure, and I collaborated with an art therapist. And what we did is we met as a group, and then we just kind of talked about what we were going to do, kind of mentally prepared. And then we all went into the studio and sat at our benches, and I gave out materials that I knew were difficult to work with, that were beyond the students' skill levels, right? Difficult color. And we all had our experiences independently, and then we regrouped after to reflect. And what happened was we were all able to express our frustration, or whatever our experience was. Not everybody experienced frustration, but that turned into actually a much deeper conversation about where the frustration was coming from. And that's where the art therapist came into play, because he was able to help keep the conversation on the rails as far as, boundaries, teacher-student boundaries. But because a lot of like emotion and stuff started coming up, as it does with failure and frustration. So that was one of the most moving classes I've ever taught. Just wanted to share. So I think at this point, I'm going to pass this over to Madeline, and she's going to, we're going to kind of flip flop, and she's going to take over as facilitator. And while we're switching over, Kate, would you like to chime in?
Yeah. Hey, so I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Kate. I'm not currently teaching anywhere, but I just got out of grad school at VCU, so I was recently teaching. But just on that, dealing with failure and dealing with frustration, I think one helpful thing I've noticed is when I assigned technical assignments, especially in Flameworking, making 10 or 20 of something due, because it's a lot harder for them to focus on, one pulled point being super crooked if there's 20. So that was always something that I found helpful, is like if they're working in multiples, much harder to focus on all of the nitty-gritty details of one thing.
I love that. Thanks, Kate. I also, that's what I'm finding myself too. Like I used to, I think things just get too precious with beginner students. And also something I found is a lot of beginners, when they go to the studio in free time, they might not even know what to make, even though I'm like, here's a demo. Okay, make it in your free time. But I actually literally have to assign okay, do 10 rows of 5 Marias, or, something silly. But something that can be meditative like that. So I'm actively restructuring my curriculum to do exactly what you're mentioning. And so much I feel of what we're doing here is just or what I find myself saying is just make a new one. It'll be better the second time. Which may or may not be wasteful depending on what they're making. But yeah. All right, Jen.
Hi, I didn't really want to be the last one to introduce myself, but I think it's time that I have to do it. So my name is Jean. I'm a teacher at Sheridan College. It's been my 7th year. Hey, I learned flameworking from Sally in 1996, I think, and then I started to teach 1999. So it's been a while, in and out. However, I teach first year introductory class, and then so is the flameworking. And then these days, what I'm more focusing is 3D modeling and then flameworking with the CNC machining. So it's quite different things, but I think it will be quite interesting if I merge that together. So it's a little far away, but I think it's going to be my lifetime goal to merge things together to create some fusions out of it. Yeah, so that's about it. Yeah. So I was curious. This is just probably the weird questions, but thinking about frustration in flameworking, to ease that by repeating things over. I think it's a great idea. What I was thinking at some point was like, what if we do it as a group? I was wondering if any of you guys are actually planning it or have tried it. Like I remember, Jim might remember at RISD, there was a one time called the Factory Day in a hot shot blowing. So everyone is making a cup, but then one person just blow a bubble, hand it to this next person, and then do the second gather, and then hand it to the third person to jack it. So there's a sort of a factory line. So one person is continuously doing the same parts of the process, but then that it goes through the steps, and then at the end it turns into the cup. Of course, that cup is not a cup. It's very weird shape. I don't know, by doing that process repeatedly, but at least you see that the final result coming out of it, although it's weird, it's not your fault. It's everybody's fault. So I'm wondering, anyone actually try that kind of project with the flameworking? I'm curious. Madeline, you've been doing many of the group projects, so I was curious. Do you see that it has advantage, or that's the question I wanted to share?
Thanks, Jen. I love that question. And also your example of like a group project or exercise where there's almost like a diffusion of responsibility. So if the end result looks bad, no one has to feel bad about taking credit for that. Because I think that's great, because I think that's what so many people struggle with, is like, well, the end result isn't perfect. It's not about the end result, it's the journey, right? Yeah, I love the idea. I'm like starting to think like, what can be an exercise like that with flameworking? Like, you got my ideas rolling. I definitely have started more recently having people do things like, okay, you practice a cold seal or a punty. Now literally just practice the same piece, like punting it like 10 times. And, I got that from like the hot shop. Like some people call that like punty ball, like as a class, like you practice that. And I'm like, oh, like we need to do that in the flame shop. So I'm kind of taking those like repetitive factory things and, but I love that question. Amy, you've had your hand up for a little while. Oh, wait, you're muted again. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, here. So not so much for like a 4-credit course unless you assign it, but for open access, one thing that worked really well, or anybody in contemporary art where there's a precedent for fabrication and collaboration, I think collaboration can be a really great way to kind of mitigate failure. And play to people's strengths, right? But it's interesting to see if you put people in groups or pair folks up, what they can come up with, and they can kind of teach each other or assist each other, or there's any number of things that can happen when you have people work together. I've had that work most successfully in when I'm teaching in New York, where a lot of the artists are not skilled in flameworking, but they have like these very rich ideas and are maybe fluent in other ways of making. And so they get frustrated easily with the glass because they're used to being able to be fluent with the material. So that's one way that I've been able to kind of like focus the students into the material and being present with the material. And there's really nothing in those situations that say the author has to be one person. So I think that's also important. If you can get away with it, or you can frame a project like that, the author, there's no reason why the author has to be one person. And like you were saying, Jen, in a factory setting, you wouldn't see that. You also wouldn't see that in a contemporary art workshop. So.
Exactly. I love that. I love that perspective, Amy. Sally.
Well, one thing I do is I try to group people together. This is pre-COVID time. To make a musical instrument, and they have to, it has to be all connected, but they have to play it together. And so my favorite one was my teaching assistant and I made a flute that we played cheek to cheek. So I blew one way and he blew the other way. That was Miles Dreyer. And, but it kind of, try to get people interacting with each other and working with each other. And then when I'm teaching like at Penland or Pilchuck or these other places, I try to get my student to collaborate with somebody else in another class and make 2 to 4 of the things, because they may fail. And then they can each have one. So, like maybe go down to the weaving room and see, how can we bring glass to weaving, and how can weaving come to glass? So even outside of the flame shop, bringing different aspects in. I don't know.
I love that. Thanks, Sally. So like what I'm hearing here is a lot of these cool, like kind of collaborative, sort of almost like gestures where they're exercises, but they can also be kind of experimental or like almost performative in a way. And I think there's something like, as a teacher, I feel like I'm at least like a facilitator of like connection, not only of course between me and the students, but hopefully between the students together, like as a class, like, and hopefully like the goal is they'll become more and more connected as a community throughout the semester or throughout the week or whatever, however long it is. But I feel like exercises like that, or discussions, like things to you kind of have to break the ice for them. And then hopefully behind the scenes, when you're not there outside of class, like they're like joining together more and kind of becoming resources for one another. I also love what Percy says in the chat about like people doing like teams of doing long seals so you can make the longest one. It's like a cool technical exercise. Kind of sounds like a glass Olympics type thing too. Like, yeah, I love it. Amy. Oh, you're muted again. So you're not used to having to.
So I'm not used to it. I just want to circle back, bring it all back to Sean's question about folks working in the studio on their own. When you have collaborative projects or group projects, that is such an icebreaker that then the students will feel a lot more comfortable, like, asking each other for help or, approaching each other when you're not there. And that makes for a much more safe environment, I think, after hours.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'll go on to the next question. And, if we're going to continue this sort of peer-to-peer thing. So if anyone has any random questions or advice or comments for the group that they just want to share, feel free to shout them out at any time. So my next question is, what is your favorite thing to teach? And that could be like, what do you like teaching, or what do you feel like students want us to teach? What gets classes filling? And kind of wondering like, who dictates the curriculum? Is there a curriculum? Is it the students who dictate the curriculum? Is it you? Is it the institution if there is one? Yeah, so if anyone has any thoughts about any of that, let me know. In the meantime, I'll keep talking. So as far as I'm concerned, I just love teaching beginner and intermediate students. I never really became like very, very like I didn't figure out one thing that's like my thing that I teach. Like it's my style, it's my work. I kind of like to teach it all. And kind of like the fundamental building blocks of technique. So I love just working with beginner and intermediate. And I think, just thinking about like every time I teach a new class like that, kind of thinking about like, they're blank slate each time when they're beginners. So like, what way do I introduce like work? Like, do I teach just solid sculpting first? Do I teach just networking first? I love doing networking and kind of working structurally, because once the students like understand hot seals, cold seals, they can make literally anything, and they start to go big, which is really exciting. Start to think a little more sculpturally. So that's my personal favorite. Anything else? Anyone find like something students always request? Or Amy? Yeah, you're muted again.
Okay, I got it. This is just the current situation, but I am really into improvising and like making up techniques and like pushing the envelope. Like, what can be a blow mold? Can we blow into food? Can we blow, what can we do, But my students are like at a different part of their journey. And right now my class is really into, they're digging hollow sculpture, and they all are, most of them are, all the demo requests have been like animals, figures, like sculpting from life. So I'm trying to kind of meet them halfway with that. Maybe we can use some funky experimental techniques when we do that.
I love the experimental techniques thing, because I think so much of like being a student, so much like for beginner students or whoever being a student, like you think there's a certain way to do something, and it turns out like there's a zillion ways to do something. And some teachers are like, this way is the only correct way. And some teachers like, this way is the only correct way. And if anyone else who says that is wrong. And in my journey as a student, I've found that conflicting things. And I was like, oh man, I thought that one person was right. Like, turns out, no, like take all the information you can from all different directions, but take it with a grain of salt and then do what you will with it. And then that's sort of what I more like the posture I take when I'm teaching, where I'm like, look, this is how I would do it. Like, you don't have to do it my way, but like, for certain things, like I recommend like doing my way, but look, listen to other people. Like, no one's right, no one's wrong. Like, I try to remove, like, I don't want there to be any type of hierarchy where anyone thinks like, I think that my way is the only way to do it. I see some hollow networking, organic blow molds. Yeah, that's awesome. All right, Priscilla.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself. I recently gave a demo to Susie's like non-major, like a survey class of like sculpting and networking, and none of them really have a lot of art background per se. And so when I was sculpting with them, I got them to like isolate blobs. Like, we would just like whatever they drew, what they wanted to make, but then like the next sketch would be isolating, like breaking this sculpture down into like various blobs, and then like teaching them how to hot seal those blobs together. And they knew nothing, and they only got that one demo. And the class after, like when I went in to go check the kiln, they made some pretty good stuff. Like, I think figuring out a way to teach kids that are not specifically like art oriented, that come into these classes just for fun, I think that was like a good way to like think about it structurally and like three-dimensionally to like break down blobs. And now I see in the room, they like everything they make now is just like blob circles that they like drew and attached together. So yeah, it was a good idea.
I love that. Thanks, Priscilla. Sorry, I was muted this time. I love that. Thanks, Priscilla. Especially if you break things down to blobs, is like ideal, because the glass wants to be blobby, right? And people are always complaining, let's do blobby. But I love thinking of things in terms of like blobcatecture. Amy.
Well, I will say this is starting to change, but I've taught bead making for, probably like 20 years. And folks always ask me to like copy other people's beads, and also to demonstrate like Italian technique, which I can do, but I don't feel a connection to. And so I would rather make up some new design. So my challenge these days, and the way I've been trying to reformulate my bead classes, is to start to have like some generative design in the beginning of class, where we're like observing from our environment, or, like having some kind of like amount of resource material around us that we can draw from, and then like adapt what they want to do, which is like, let's say we want to do some dots, or we want to do, whatever your decorative patterns are, but to apply them in a way that is unique to each person. That's not just copying someone else's work. And to try to get a little bit more, like, I'm not even sure what you would call it, like, definitely trying to limit the cultural appropriation, but also to give the artists or the flame workers some kind of agency over their own designs, and create something that is like really voicing their own point of view and not just copying somebody else's, so that they can tell if they're achieving the technique or not. So I guess it's like almost like revaluing what success could be.
I love that. Thanks, Amy. Sally, and then Janine.
Yeah, like when I teach ring seals, in my little scientific glass blowing class, we'll make a little bubbler, and everybody makes the same little bubbler. And then I tell them, okay, now take those techniques that you learned and make something I've never seen before. And then the class goes just nuts, and everybody's doing something different, and it's wonderful. Yeah.
I love that. Wow, I'm getting such great ideas. I'm like taking notes. Make something I've never seen before. How fun. Janine.
The last lamp work class I taught, I began by asking everybody, what is beautiful to you and why? Why do you find something beautiful? Why does that work? For me, that's often like gradients of size, gradients of color, smooth transitions. Like there's so many different answers. And then with these ideas in mind, whatever your answers are, I remind everybody that everything that isn't naturally occurring is made by a person. And if you don't know how to do it, you can certainly learn or try, but like shoes, buildings, noodles, like you can make all of these things. And then, so think about what is beautiful and what do you want to exist? And you can build off of what already exists, or you can try to build something that you've never seen before. But just challenging people to think about what they like and why, and what they want and why.
I love it. That's awesome. Great. So I think I'm going to move on to my next question. Well, first, I do have a question for you guys, if anyone wants to answer this, which I'm always fascinated with this, is what is the first thing you teach when you teach a class? And I guess this like is more for people who teach like beginner, intermediate, or any level of class, because I always kind of take note when I take a workshop, like what's the first thing so-and-so teaches? Like for me, it's usually like, how to like do a scribble with glass rod, or just like, doing dripping the glass down and making a teardrop. But that's something I'm always curious, like, because I teach like bare bones things, but then want to introduce like how to add on that and have a little more fun. And then in the meantime, my other question is, what have you learned about about teaching by being a student? Or what have you learned about being a student by being a teacher? And I guess, I'll go ahead and answer my own question here while I'm waiting, because I think about this a lot. And as a teacher, something I've noticed is like some students, there's different types, and some students want a lot of information. They want me to tell them, they want to see the demo, they want to take notes and know exactly how to do the thing, like how I would say to do it. And some students just go for it. Like some just, take whatever information, just start playing, and start kind of fooling around, playing with it. And I always find the students in the latter group always seem to they improve like exponentially faster, especially right off the bat. And I find myself always saying to like the more timid students or sort of seem to ask for permission, like, just go for it. Just mess up, like see what happens and see what you can learn from that. And, as a teacher, by viewing that has taught me about being a student, like that I want to be that latter example as a student. I just, whenever it feels appropriate and possible, if I can just go for something and just try to figure it out, don't be afraid of failing. And like just sort of experiment and sort of take things into my own hands. That's something I've learned recently. Mosley.
So one of the things that I think, being a new teacher and all, so I don't have like this, crazy background of like what works and what doesn't work, but I've just experienced it in my short period of time is I don't come in like, blazing hot, it's like I kind of come in, you know, if you guys know me, I'm not serious that all the time. You know, I swear. Sorry, there's my studio's near a road. There's dudes love to rip around. You know, I'm not serious. I swear. I crack jokes. In the beginning of class, I always try to have someone like, you know, like everybody kind of introduce themselves. I'll give them a little story, you know, before we actually like sit down, I'll like shoot the shit with them. And like, there's this, the last class I taught, it was a senior in high school and his dad was with him and he's got to like do a bunch of art before he's applying to RISD and he has to try all of these different mediums. Sorry, he wants to get into industrial design. So we were just talking about like different schools and, you know, as someone who went to art school, you know, way back when, that wasn't for glass. I was just like, man, you never know, like you might not become an industrial designer. So just like getting comfortable, I think with people in the beginning, seems to work. And then same with you, Madeline. I mostly start off with like getting the torch right, like the flame chemistry on like where it's going to just burn the best so they can like get the optimal melting of the glass. After that, you know, I kind of go into just gathering with one hand. But I try to, like I said, I don't try to like, you know, like focus so much on like just pulling it right or getting the prime shape that's going to set you up for the next stage. It's going to set you up for the next stage. I'm just like letting them get through it because I've noticed every single time that I've done it. And like I said, it hasn't been that many. By the end of the class, they're really starting to jam. They're really starting to see how the glass works and they're really starting to feel it. But I think it's because like I didn't sit there and like be like, you got to make this perfect. You got to do it this way. I'm just like getting through it and I'm showing them the important steps, but I'm like getting them to like do it. And then I walk around and like observe every single one. And then when I see them hanging up, I'll be like, I'll let them do it. And then I'll ask them if they want help. And then sometimes I'll take the rod from them and then like execute that part they were hanging up on and then give it back to them. And then like I'll point out things and I just always try to show encouragement. Like I'm really kind of, like I said, I noticed that like if you're just like fun with it, people seem to just like warm up with you a lot more than being like, oh, I've been blowing glass a million years and like I got all this going on and blah blah. You're like, hey, like let's just make some shit and see what happens. You know, like at least in my traffic area, it's a lot of people seem to be receptive to that style of teaching. And I think for me, it works because I'm someone who is definitely going off the beaten path and landed in a good spot. You know, like I didn't take the traditional way and I just came up with my own method and it worked. So I'm like, hey, if you just throw shit at the wall, it might stick. So, you know, I think if I would have got that from the beginning, you know, it would have like, I'm hoping that someone will take that and go with it. And it seems to be, I get good feedback. You know, everyone's always like, man, the class was fun. They enjoy it. So I think that's kind of like for me, like I said, it might be different if you're trying to do advanced wig wags or whatever, your crazy seals. It might be a little bit different. You might need the notes. You might need all that stuff. But like if it's their first time or like they don't even know if they're going to ever do it again, let's just have fun. Let's just see what happens. Long if, you know, obviously you got to go through safety and all that stuff. But, you know, once you get through that stuff, it's like, hey, let's just have fun and see what happens. And that seems to be a really good, you know, like I've gotten return people to come take the class because it's fun.
I love it. I agree. I'm like, let's have fun because if we're not having fun, what's the point of even doing any of this? And building a rapport, like some people are saying, like with icebreakers or sort of little icebreaker assignments at the very beginning. I think whatever we can do to make the students as comfortable as possible, because what I sense is often they're just so timid, like it's a new space, new people, and they're literally working with fire for the first time. It's terrifying. Like they're so scared just to light the torch. Like I find that's often like the biggest roadblock, and like they can't get the striker to go. It's like a whole thing. And so much just like allowing them to feel comfortable, like messing up in front of one another. And, you know, because that's the other thing is often like you think everyone's watching you if it's in a large shared studio, like Salem. And it's like, no, like everyone's here, everyone's learning. Yeah. So I think, we're getting pretty close to the end here. But I want to, open it up and, if there's anything else anyone wants to talk about or any like closing questions or comments. I think this has been such a wonderful discussion. I could definitely like keep this up longer, or maybe do a round 2 for this. Yeah. Yeah, Amy. You got it.
Not to learn, not so much a question, but I just want to say that I just want to check in and just say how much I appreciate this conversation, and that we're able to all act as peers in here. And I don't know about any of you, but I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of times I'm like the only flame worker in the community, and the community has been growing. And it's just such a pleasure to be here with other teachers talking about what I love and sharing that. So thank you all.
Absolutely agree.
We're multiplying. We're multiplying.
I think this is by far like the biggest conversation. Like, I've never talked to this many Flameworking teachers before, like in a group. This is like a first in my life. It's so exciting. So, all right, beautiful. So, Percy.
So I was thinking about, what have I learned about being about teaching from being a student? And I don't think I've not been a student. Like, I'll give you a big example. Like this past summer, I was co-teaching with Angie McHale and Patrick Glazinski, and like, I'm not very strong with flame working, particularly. I can do a seal that works, but I learned a lot from watching them and seeing how they manipulate the glass. And I use those moments where I like tap into what they're showing me and like doing that in the background to like understand how to teach that same thing to someone who's probably had my same sort of feeling about like, I'm not really confident in this, but holy shit, I did this thing and it worked. And then there's all these different contexts that make it work. So like Angie was just like moving further back and going to like the International Flameworking Conference and seeing how Angie handled when you have an articulate arm to move the glass and separate it. I applied that moment and used it against pieces that were too large for me to unseal. So I couldn't move the piece, but I could move the tubing and rotate it. So things like that have just been notes. Like I think at Pilchuck, I was always writing notes, and it could be something like what a student was doing, or like what I might have to plan ahead for the next day, or what someone had said, or questions that have been asked. So I think it's just always been happening simultaneously. Like learning and teaching is happening because they're exchanging with each other constantly.
Absolutely. Thanks, Percy. I think that's ideal. And yeah, I love learning from my students. I also think it's great for students to have like an example of a teacher who doesn't act like they know everything, a teacher who's curious, who's open to having information, so learning new information, learning from the students. I think even just modeling that behavior in itself is like so amazingly valuable. And I've loved that. I've learned a lot when I've had teachers who demonstrate that as opposed to the opposite. Amy.
When I teach like master classes or like workshops, not so much at the college level, I don't finish my demos. I'll demo technique, but I'll leave it unfinished, because I started doing that a number of years ago, because I found that when I would finish the demos, then while the students were watching, then that put some unnecessary pressure on them to try something new. And I had a lot more folks try the techniques when I would either mess up or, do like, not finish a piece. Yeah. So that's kind of a strategy that I rely on now to make everyone feel comfortable.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Amy. Sally.
Yeah, for me, it's not about teaching glass. I mean, it's not about flame working. It's not about any of that. It's this zone that you get into, if you're a student or if you're a teacher, you're working together, this energy, this zone that you have. So it could be anything. And that's what I really like when I'm in those situations.
Like the exchange or the connection between teacher and student. Oh, I love that. That's what got me hooked on that. Just that relationship. Percy.
Yeah, I just wanted to say from what Amy mentioned, I kind of found myself doing something similar, but sort of for the similar, not same reason. And that's like, if I'm doing a demonstration, I'm showing like one part of what I want them to learn, but I also am not trying to make anything like super crazy because I don't want to influence the students' creativity to like navigate too strongly to what I would personally do for making a form or like anything like that. Because I do what I love to do, and this is sort of like I like to say it's more of like a mastermind type of thing, but I want to see students do a whole bunch of different things that I would have never thought about blowing in glass. And I sort of picked that up from Ed Kirshner because he puts in a situation where students will just do different stuff to give them the means to get to the main goal, but then not interfere with them doing things that is uniquely in their interest. And then you see people sometimes push a little too hard. And so those students getting the reel back a little bit from like doing such dynamic and bigger projects than what the class could allow is one of the things I think I have difficulties with for the most part in teaching right now.
Like having students like fly a little too close to the sun, or like have something that's too complex that's beyond like trying to have to reel them in a little bit.
Yeah, they run right into the fire, and it's just like you could just hold back a little bit. Let's like break it down. But they see it. Sometimes you gotta let them do it, and then they go, "Okay, I got it. I know now. I know what you're talking about. I understand the warnings now."
Exactly.
Like that's for you to do at home when you have more time. You can plan out your steps. You can't cram 4 weeks of activity into 3 days. Like you can't do that. You gotta slow down a little bit.
Yeah. Being a teacher, you're also kind of keeping the pace too, right? And like, as much as we hate having to reel people in or like stifle like dreams for a time being, like, yeah, like that's students don't always know what they can't do, what's not possible. Awesome. Cool. Well, we're just around a little after 9:30, so I know that's when we were going to be wrapping it up. Is there anything anyone would like to add before we say goodnight? I think this has been such a wonderful conversation. I think, yeah, I really thank you all for contributing and for chiming in. This has been so fun.
Yeah, thank you all. And also, I hope you'll consider joining us in the spring for our next meeting. And since we want to be inclusive in, choosing themes that, that cater to like the whole group. So since we were focusing on the teacher's perspective this time around in the spring, we're going to try this peer-to-peer, I think, format again with a different topic and maybe try to put together a business practices toolkit. So maybe between now and then, think about that and think about if there are any resources that you might want to share, or if you have any ideas for what you think artists who are just starting out or established tools that they should have in their toolkit, whatever that may be. And then that'll be our spring topic. So hope to see you all again. And in the meantime, I hope you have a great semester, and I hope all your students treat you well. And I hope you're having a blast teaching. And thank you so much for coming.
Yay. Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
Good to see you,
Evelyn.
Evelyn.
See you.
Thank you. Thank you. How do I hang it up?
I love the little cameo at the end.
I know. I'm sorry,
Good night,
Pop.
guys.
Good night.
Hey, this is Emily from GEEX, aka the Glass Education Exchange. GEEX is an online platform connecting people and sharing materials in the collective field of glass education. That's a bit of a mouthful. So what does it actually mean? GEEX creates supportive spaces outside of traditional academic structures to offer community-building programming and resources. Programs like the Flame Affinity Group offer a space for constructive dialogue between practitioners in the field. We're hoping to nudge the field of glass into its next generation through new models of community support. This recording is also available through one of our initiatives, the Glass Resource Exchange. The Glass Resource Exchange is a user-contributed library collecting and sharing educational material like articles, supply lists, videos, and more. We're hoping to see it grow as a common resource supporting glass teaching and learning. Want to support GEEX? Small donations really help us continue building our communal programming. Alternatively, you can subscribe to our lecture series featuring outstanding glass artists and researchers. Learn more at geeks.glass/support. Thanks for watching. Want updates on new GEEX programs and resources? Follow @GeeksGlass on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, or visit our website, geeks.glass. Thanks again, and stay tuned.